Tim Wise is an anti-racist educator, and he has written these 13 questions for people who want critical race theory banned. And so I thought I'd answer them because I want critical race theory banned, in the same way that I don't want my schools teaching Mein Kampf and Nazism to my children, because critical race theory is Nazism for non-white people. I hate to say it, but as I'm against all forms of Nazism, I must oppose critical race theory, and I've done an awful lot of work on this, understanding it. So let's tackle what Tim has to say, because I don't think Tim is as well read on this as he thinks. Or if he is, he's being basically dishonest. So he says, for the past year, conservatives have been waging war on what they call critical race theory in schools. But I mean, the critical race theorists call it themselves, which often amounts to nothing more than an honest accounting of racism in American history. Critical race theory, right, is actually got very little to do with that, like a historical accounting. What it's more about is an understanding of legal precedents and the Marxist interpretation of those precedents from a race consciousness perspective. So they're looking at them going, so what does this mean for the blacks against the whites? Because the whites are oppressing the blacks in all times and all places. So what can the blacks do about it, right?
Mm-hmm. I think one of the main reasons that they bring this up all the time is because they're trying to rub people's noses in the so-called legacy of slavery, isn't it? It's like a absolutely rhetorical device that they're doing. It's not necessarily relevant to critical race theory, but it's one of the hardest hitting punches.
Yeah. And so he says the goal, it appears, is to prohibit any analysis of our country's history that might detract from an entirely uncritical nationalism. It's like, no. That's what a massive misrepresentation. Don't teach black Nazism in schools. Oh, you're an uncritical nationalist. No, Tim. That's a very dishonest frame.
Very binary way of putting it, isn't it?
It's a very binary way to put it. And so he's like, in the interest of transparency, it seems only fair that people should be expected to respond to the following questions. Okay, let's go through it. So question 1 is, the legislation proposed or passed thus far prohibits material intended to make students feel guilt, shame, or discomfort because of their race. While all agree that no one should seek to make another person feel bad because of their racial identity, how will the intent of such material and teachers who teach it be determined? If the material presents factual information or an analysis of historical events for consideration, what happens to make students or parents feel bad, should it be disallowed? It's like, well, the judgment isn't about the intent, is it? It's about the consequence. But it's the framing of the events which conscript white people who are living now into a framework that holds them responsible for the guilt of their ancestors who often had a different ideological perspective, as in they were Democrats who wanted to preserve their slaves. This and a framework that has, of course, been abandoned by most right-thinking people. There's no reason that these white children now need to be conscripted into that. They're not responsible for it. They're not the inheritors of an ancestral guilt. And so this is the problem. It's not about teaching information, because there are lots of different ways of approaching a thing. Like when we say, when we talk about 9/11, we don't say every Muslim is responsible for 9/11. And so it's quite easy to do that, I think. But if Tim Wise can't see the difference, then perhaps it is just that he thinks all white people are guilty of slavery.
It's a very weird thing to resurface. It's almost like the Catholic concept of original sin, that you've just inherited sin.
Absolutely.
You're born into it.
And so if you're adopting a framework that is specifically saying whiteness and white people are bad, then you are deliberately making them feel bad for being white. And that's something that can be prohibited while still teaching an event happened. I mean, do we talk about how the Moroccans are all evil because they used to enslave the Cornish? No.
Maybe sometimes.
But I mean, like he says that, whiteness is the problem, but this is the racial identity of white people. So saying whiteness is the problem is trying to make students feel guilt, shame, or discomfort for their race.
And it's more egregious than that even, because they're young enough that they're going to accept the authority of the teacher, and they're not going to be able to question it for themselves. I'm sure some of them bright students might,
but a lot of them won't.
Yeah, exactly. And they're just going to have this guilt put on them, which is undeserved.
Absolutely. And Tim Wise is like, yeah, but why shouldn't we teach that? That's teaching history. It's like, there we go. You think that all white people are responsible for this thing, even the white people who stopped it, incidentally. Why would you teach that framing and not you're on the side of the North who freed the slaves? Why wouldn't you teach them in that framework? But Tim can't see the difference.
I mean, even if what he said was true, it's still deeply irresponsible to make
it is.
Children feel self-loathing, because it's not healthy for them.
Absolutely. But anyway, number 2, the legislation also seeks to prohibit materials that suggest that America is an inherently racist nation, which again is the critical race theory contention number one is that America is an inherently racist nation, as shown by the 1619 Project. But what does this mean? Well, why don't you go and ask the authors of the 1619 Project, Tim? Because asking what does this mean, I mean, it's directly stated. It's quite a clear thing. It is inherently racist against black people, as in it discriminates on the basis of race against black people. That is the inherent intrinsic property of the United States. That's what it means. Tim, you dishonest shill, okay? For example, he says, slavery was embedded in the US in its inception, as was white supremacy. That's not true, right? Slavery existed in the US, but the founders of the US Constitution, the framers, the revolutionaries, were well aware that this was going to end slavery, and only didn't because they didn't think they'd be able to get the South on board for the revolution if they said, by the way, we're getting rid of your slaves too, but lads, you know, that was an issue that was put on the back burner. He should know that, right? And so him claiming that this is, it's an inherently racist thing, it's like, okay, well then, isn't every country that's ever had slavery some sort of inherent racist or evil country?
So basically every country on earth, and therefore asserting that it's a racist country has no value whatsoever.
Exactly.
Also, it's interesting as well.
Every African country is a racist country.
It's interesting to me that they try and make out that America is uniquely racist when, in fact, you know, isn't it one of the most racially homogenous countries in the Northern Hemisphere at the very least?
America? No, it's not racially homogenous.
The least, I mean, the other way around.
Yeah, it's very racially diverse, yeah.
Exactly. So if it's really racially diverse, surely if it's especially racist, isn't that a subtle dunk on multiculturalism? Just like, yes, multiculturalism creates racism.
Why are all these non-white people desperate to get into the most racist country in the world?
I know.
It's really
wild.
Weird.
Maybe they should ask the people on the border, is America racist? They'll be like, no.
But the thing is, right, neither the United States nor any other country is inherently racist by what I would consider, and Kimberly Crenshaw, one of the founding fathers of critical race theory, would describe as the restrictive view of racism. So I did a video about this called The Gramscian Attack on Liberal Rights, in which we examine one of Kimberly Crenshaw's key core texts, canon texts of critical race theory, where she explains there are two versions of racism that she sees. One is the expansive view of racism, and one is the restrictive view of racism. Now, the expansive view of racism is racism as judged by consequence. So if you were to flip a coin 15 times, and you said, right, every time it comes up heads, I'll give the black person $1, and every time it comes up tails, I'll give the white person $1. Comes up tails 10 times, that's racism.
Racist coin.
Because the white person has $10 and the black person has $5. It's not the same outcome, and therefore that would be racism. That's what the expansive view says.
So that is a white supremacist coin. Yes. Decided to flip in favor of the white person.
Yes. That's exactly what that's exactly the conclusion she would have to come to.
Seems like the conclusions of a sane person.
Yeah. There's a bit of an exaggerated example, but she would have to conclude there was a form of racism.
Well, I think that's a good example because in many cases it's more complicated than that, but more or less it's the same mechanism affecting things. It's just chance and a multitude of different factors dictating outcomes. You can't just say, is this one factor? Oh, it's racism.
Yeah, exactly. You don't even know, but
hundreds.
They're judging it exclusively on whether the consequence is equal between whatever metric you're using in the categories of race. Whereas the restrictive view of racism is the view that a normal liberal person has. And this is why they're attacking the liberal foundation of the United States. The restrictive view of racism is a matter of intent, as in someone wants to target, wants to discriminate against someone because of their race. And of course, that's very rare these days because most people are not racist according to Kimberly Crenshaw's restrictive view. And so the expansive view is what the systemic view of racism is. So suddenly just the entire thing, if you can look at disparities between blacks and whites, racism, entire system is responsible, job done, let's go home. It's like, no, that's a pathetic way of looking at it. Anyway, number 3. Several states have proposed giving parents the right to sue teachers and schools that violate the new rules or teach divisive subjects. But since divisiveness is subjective and a parent might overreact, might the fear of being sued intimidate teachers and dissuade them from discussing anything about racism in history or possibly any controversial issue? God, I hope so. God, yeah, that'd be great. Like, I'm tired of hearing about it. I'm sure the students are tired of hearing about it, black and white. Like, I'm sure they're much more interested about hearing about anything else at this point. Right, and so if teachers avoid such topics for fear of white parents suing, wouldn't that? And why just white parents? Why couldn't black parents sue over this? He just assumes it's white parents. It's very interesting, isn't it? But wouldn't that disrespect people of color by ignoring issues that are important to them? Are you sure it's important to them? Are you sure it's not just that it's being pumped into their heads constantly? By the way, you blacks, yeah, you're the victims here, the victims of slavery. Yeah, it happened a long time ago, and it's not.
So this white guy's putting the words in the mouth of black people, and he's the one that's against racism.
Yes, he's puppeteering them here, and so he says, if so, could they sue schools for not talking about these subjects? If not, why not? It's like, look, no, that you're looking for certainty where certainty does not exist here. What we're going to do is use our reasonable judgment in each circumstance with an eye to goodwill towards the black and white students. And that means we're not just going to have one rule that's the same in all times and all places, which is what you're asking for. Deal with it, Tim. This is just, it's a dishonest premise to say I want certainty where none can possibly exist. And if you want to know more about this framing that he's approaching here, I would recommend our book club on Michael Oakeshott's Rationalism in Politics. He does an excellent job of explaining why rationalists like Wise are demanding certainty of an uncertain world, and how this is a standard that is impossible to match, and in fact a more reasonable and flexible view, what we could call the conservative view, is actually much more appropriate when dealing with the feelings of, say, the people involved in a discussion about historic racism. Anyway, what do I know? What does Oakeshott know? What critical race theorist? Let's carry on. He says, teaching that white supremacy is the cornerstone of the Confederacy, according to their own vice president, might cause some white parents to think that teachers were trying to make them feel shame because their families fought for the Confederacy. If so, should teachers no longer tell the truth about why those states seceded? I'm not an expert on the American Civil War, but I'm not really convinced about Tim Wise's characterization of anything. So I'll just say that shame for having fought for the Confederacy is not the same as shame because of your race. Tim? Remember, it was about shame because of race, and you've now moved those goalposts. Oh, it's shame about no, shame about their families. No, who knows? Who knows? But it's not about the race. So there's no particular reason that would come up unless you're being a dishonest agent. But more importantly, why, again, do you have to adopt a framing that is trying to create a form of guilt for children now? There's no historic guilt that they bear, in my opinion. Why are you so insistent on this point? Number 5, one of the groups leading the charge against the anti-racist curriculum is Mums for Liberty. On their website, they've recommended the historical work of W. Cleon Skousen. Never heard of him. Among other things, Skousen believed that white enslavers were the worst victims of enslavement, that enslaved black folks were cheerful despite their bondage, and that the civil rights movement was being manipulated from Moscow with a goal to creating a Soviet Negro Republic. He sounds sane.
That just sounds amusing to me.
Do you agree? If not, why are you allying with a group that recommends this material, even as it seeks to remove children's books about MLK Jr. from classrooms? I don't agree, and I don't care. I mean, I'm sure that I have the same opinion as Mums for Liberty on the taste of bacon, that it's delicious, but that doesn't mean I co-sign everything that they state.
There's also the point that, is it Martin Luther King Jr., who quite often gets disavowed by many critical race theorists anyway. Why are they using that to defend them?
They do have a narrative on Martin Luther King Jr., but it is against his, I would like to be judged by my children to be judged by the content of the character.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, they disavow that, but they do have his, we'll talk about it in a minute actually, his critical theology that they believe they can extract from his work. Anyway, number 6, if material about white privilege or systemic racism can be prohibited because it offends white people, should we ban material celebrating founding fathers who owned human beings or westward expansion, which might make black or indigenous persons equally uncomfortable? If not, why the difference? Are you saying that white students can't be made uncomfortable, but non-white students can be? Yeah, that's right, Tim. That's exactly what they're saying. White students can't be made uncomfortable, but non-white students, you uncharitable dick. That's obviously not what's being said. Like, what framing is this? This is so dishonest. The point, Tim, is that white privilege and what was the other one? Systemic racism are ideological interpretations of events. They're theoretical, right? You think they're real. Other people don't think they're real, right? But the other, what you're bringing up, as in the founding fathers owning slaves or westward expansion, these are brute historical facts. It was true that they owned slaves. It is true, or was true, that the United States expanded westward in its manifest destiny. This is not about ideological interpretation. This is just, this happened. Whereas you are pointing things, well, white privilege happened where? What are you talking about? Show, this is your interpretation of an event. This is the event itself. Again, you're just such a dishonest hack, right? Anyway, number 7. In teaching about World War II, should Japanese American parents be able to veto teaching about the attack on Pearl Harbor, since it might lead to hostility against their kids because of their familial origins? As if in the classrooms they're like, yeah, so the Japanese kid, it's his fault. He is the one responsible for Pearl Harbor. This is the problem. This is exactly the problem. You're in fact revealing your hand here. You can't not think of them as being responsible. This is what, otherwise you wouldn't bring that up, because no one in their right mind would be like, yeah, so white kids should be held responsible for slavery. So yeah, but what about Japanese kids in Pearl Harbor? What do you mean? By the same principle, they're not responsible for that either. You dunce. But the thing is, right, should Muslim and Arab American parents be able to veto material about 9/11 for fear it might provoke animosity towards their children? What, from people who read your blog? As in people are like, yeah, they're all the same. They're all responsible for all of the, the ethnic guilt they carry, which is what you're peddling here. And if you're like, yeah, but if you can't have ethnic guilt about these people, what about the ethnic guilt about the other people? It's like, yeah, well, that will go too. No, this will not be the case. And like in Europe, we've had many wars and there are many European children in our schools, and we don't be like, oh yeah, in 1792, your country invaded my country and therefore you're bad.
Unless they're French.
But the only reason hostility would be stoked is if the implication was that every group carries a moral debt, which is something, incidentally, the critical race theory actively endorses. You have, and this is the 5th video on critical race theory explained that I've done, Race Consciousness, Black Genocide and Affirmative Action, where they, in this video, we examine essays in which they talk about how, well, they think that every race is a kind of collective and a kind of organism that is under threat from integration and people, living with each other and being normal and treating each other as people rather than as political representatives of their race, which is what you're trying to do, Tim, incidentally. So you can go check that out if you'd like to learn more. Number 8, if systemic racism can't be discussed as a reason for ongoing racial inequities in the US, because this might cast aspersions on America as a racist nation, as in might, that's the definition. These are necessary consequences. What explanations for inequality will be allowed in classroom discussions? Should we ask Thomas Sowell? What's his opinion?
Thomas Sowell's great, by the way.
I know, he's fantastic because he's right. And incidentally, the critical race theorists, especially Kimberly Crenshaw, have a lot of complaints about Thomas Sowell in the Gramscian attack on liberal rights, whatever it was. She, in that essay, she's responding to Thomas Sowell because Thomas Sowell is BTF Foda. He's like, well, look, this is your own fault for not getting a job and getting married, buying a house, blah, blah, blah. And she's like, yeah, but slavery. And she's just whining about him throughout the whole thing. Right. But the point is, this is the thing. There are lots of reasons for inequality. Racism is actually not really appear to be one. I can't identify any active discrimination against black people. But again, we adhere to Kimberly Crenshaw's restrictive view of racism, where it's active discrimination.
Well, there's active discrimination in their favour.
In their favour, yeah, exactly. There's plenty of affirmative action, and that might turn out to be illegal because it's racial discrimination. But the thing is, right, what should be explained to them is that inequality is just a fact of life. It should be explained as normal. Everyone is not equal. No one is equal to one another. In fact, as Thomas Sowell said, a man isn't even equal to himself on different days. And I tell you what, man, I am feeling that after doing all this exercise. Right? I went climbing yesterday, and I had a really hard time riding my bike in this morning. I was not the equal of myself yesterday riding in before I'd gone climbing because I was just aching. This idea of equality is just baffling, and it's not really what America's about. America's about freedom, which is the antithesis of equality, because any amount of freedom, of course, destroys equality, so people make different choices. And this is why people should be taught about prudence, really, good decision making. But anyway, question 9. If you answer, as many conservatives would, that teachers should discuss things like out-of-wedlock birth or lack of personal responsibility, he knows why. He knows why. He knows why. Mask off, you know why, Tim. As reasons for ongoing disparities in economic well-being, it's only because they factually are. What if these explanations offend black students or parents because they stigmatize black people, culture, and communities? Oh, do they? Are they stigmatized? Is that another mask-off moment? That black people, if you say a lack of personal responsibility is the cause of inequality, black people are stigmatized by that, are they? That's an interesting take, Tim. Interesting take. I think there are black people who can exhibit personal responsibility, by the way. Don't know whether you do, Tim.
I think you needed to add that caveat, to be honest.
Well, yeah, but I think I do, because otherwise Tim Wise might be like, what are you talking about? But no, this is not, believe it or not, right? This is something that happens on an individual level, Tim. Again, like you can't teach personal responsibility to a group, you can only teach it to a person. And it is the aggregate of persons in the group exercising personal responsibility that is how you get your result, how you get your number. So when you aggregate it all out and go, well, white people earn this much and black people earn that much, and therefore white people must be being racist to black people. Or if you were to break that down in a much more granular way, you'd be looking at the life choices of that individual person, which is what Thomas Sowell does. And he's like, yeah, so black people actually, on average, make a lot of poor choices that they really shouldn't make because they get worse outcomes. And that's what you need to be talking about. That's not stigmatization. That's called education, Tim. So no, you would not want to ban that because that would be ridiculous, wouldn't it? Ban black people from learning about how they can improve their lives. Tim Wise, 2022. Also, those blacks, they lack personal responsibility, don't they? Tim Wise, what is wrong with you? You're a disgusting human being. But again, I love that he knows the reasons for the inequalities and he admits it there. So anyway, number 10. You say we should focus less on the history of racism in America and more on the nation's progress. But how can one appreciate progress without a clear sense of how deeply embedded white supremacy and racism were and how awful these things were for non-white persons for most of our history? That already existed. Like, people know about slavery and then Jim Crow.
It wasn't like they didn't talk about it until critical race theory came about. It's just like, this thing that we never talked about. Oh.
Yeah. The Democrats wanted their slaves, and then they had to fight a civil war, and then they wanted segregation, and then they had to have the civil rights movement because the Democrats are evil, and they always have been evil, and now they've got critical race theory, which is, again, a way of being racially evil. Tim, that was always well known. Like, this didn't require critical race theory. But the thing is, again, excessive focus on this is just an attempt to impart a kind of historic blood guilt onto white people in America, and that's also immoral. That's what you're trying to do, and that is also immoral. Positioning yourself as like the alpha cuck of white people, as you're trying to do to profit from this blood guilt, it's illiberal, immoral, and completely racist in and of itself, according to my restrictive view of racism, which is one I'm not prepared to give up. Anyway, he says, you quote number 11, you quote Martin Luther King Jr. a lot, at least one line about judging people by the content of their character by the color of this rather than the color of their skin. Yeah, because that's correct. That's morally correct. That's what the liberal sort of, I hate to say the Republicans are liberals, but they are the classical liberals. And this is the classical liberal framework of what anti-racism is, judging people by the content of their character rather than as a politicized member of a race. But he says, since you like King so much, have you read any of his writings? If so, name them. Nah, no one cares. We like that one line. Right? That one line is very good and summarizes the entire liberal perspective on anti-racism, Tim, right? And the thing is, though, I've read plenty of critical race theory intellectuals who are trying to take his critical theology and prophetic Christianity to pervert the founding assumptions of the US by inserting foreign assumptions about human nature, because Martin Luther King, as well as lots of other leftists, believe that human beings are just inherently good and that man is born good and made evil by society. And that's not the founding assumption of the United States.
And it's also completely wrong as well.
Yes, absolutely.
Objectively wrong.
Yes. I mean, just look at it, though. Look at the areas where, like, law and order breaks down in the United States, like, parts of Chicago and stuff like this,
The Chaz.
Yeah. Are men inherently good in those areas? Or are they, is it a war zone where dozens of people are shot every weekend? Mm-hmm. Like, you choose. But the point is, the English assumption about the nature of man is that man is inherently bad and needs to be made civil by society. And without proper instruction, he never develops a moral sense. And I think that's true. I think we can see the evidence of that before our own eyes. And you can see, as I said, I've talked about this a lot. This comes from Critical Race Theory Explained number 3, in which, again, I can't remember if this is Kimberly Crenshaw essay or not, but I can't remember who the essayist was on this one, but basically they're talking about how all of the assumptions of critical race theory are founded on this idea that it's a civilization that makes a person evil. And of course, if you have folded that into the assumption that, well, civilization is a white supremacist project, it's inherently racist, you've pathologized the civilization as evil, and you've framed the individual, the people, as being inherently good. So civilization is this oppressive force on top of good people that makes them evil, so it makes sense to try and liberate them from the civilization. However, whenever that happens, the people turn out to be even worse, they get much worse outcomes, and it turns out that the English were right about human nature, and the French were wrong.
Yeah, they should
fundamentally
just learn about the French Revolution, and that will become really quite obvious.
Yeah, I'm going to do a book club on Rousseau very soon as well, because Rousseau had some absolutely batty ideas about human nature. Yeah. Anyway, number 12. Here are 2 more things King said. Okay, first off, don't care. I literally don't care if he never said a thing after that. That's just the one thing. The one thing he says that gets quoted is because it's true, right? But anyway, first, this is from his last essay, which was published after his assassination. Can teachers teach this part of King's thinking, or will it be limited to the things King said to which you agree? I mean, yeah, that's just it. We're just going to limit it to the things King said with which we agree. Tough. The largest part of white America is still poisoned by racism, which is native to our soil as pine trees, sagebrush, and buffalo grass. And then, the philosophy and morals of the dominant white society are not holy or sacred, but in all too many respects degenerate and profane.
Degenerate, that's an interesting word.
Yeah. I mean, first off, don't care that he said this. Not vaguely interesting to me. But what would be the purpose of teaching children that most white people are racist and their morals are degenerate, if not trying to impart white guilt onto children? And if that's the case, then no, you wouldn't be allowed to teach that, would you? You know the answer to that because you quoted the purpose of this legislation is to not give children racial guilt, which is fair, you know. Don't make children ashamed of their race if that's not too much work. Tim Wise, anti-racist educator. But, you know, and the thing is this even true? I think this is quite a lot here that we could debate, but I'm not going to go into now. And number 13, the last question. In his last book, Where Do We Go From Here?, Dr. King wrote the following. It is an aspect of their sense of superiority that white people of America believe they have so little to learn. Would you agree? No, not really.
Isn't an arrogance about how little you have to learn just an inherent human thing? It's not
Why
really.
Why are white people constantly doing science if they don't think they've got anything to learn?
Yeah, it's not like they go into academia or go to university. Yeah. Isn't that one of the complaints?
Yeah, the place is overwhelmingly white, but they're in the universities learning things. Like, it's just an incorrect statement, I think. But the thing is, what's this got to do about making children feel bad about the race, other than contributing directly to it? You know, piss off communist.
If you enjoyed that segment from the podcast The Lotus Eaters, you can go to lotuseaters.com to get access to all the premium content we have on the site, such as the book club me and Carl did together on Active Measures, which is a book documenting some of the autistic weirdness that the Soviets and the CIA did to each other throughout the Cold War. But if you'd like to follow me on Getter as well, you can follow at Getter_Callum. Thank you and goodbye.